Malcolm Gladwell, what's your new book about?
It's called David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. And it's about underdogs. I got really interested in telling the stories of people who seem weak and powerless, and yet go on to accomplish great things. That was a puzzle of how they managed to do that I thought was worthy of a book. And so this is my latest.
Well, back in '09, you wrote a piece for The New Yorker.
Yeah.
David versus Goliath, about, and I'll let you tell the story, but is that when your interest started?
Yeah, I wrote a story, although weirdly that nothing in that article I wrote for The New Yorker made its way into the book, but it was what got me thinking about it. It was an article I wrote about a guy, started with the story of a guy he was an Indian immigrant living in Silicon Valley. He starts to coach his daughter's basketball team, and they're all 12, 13, and they're all the daughters of software engineers from Silicon Valley, and they can't pass, shoot, dribble, they can't do anything that resembles basketball. And so he decides what they're going to do is play maniacal defense. They're going to have the full court press 100% of every game. And that proves so devastatingly effective that they go all the way to the national championship. And so the idea was that he responded to a weakness, the fact that they had no basketball skills, by adapting, and by adapting in a way that proved to be pretty devastating, and also by breaking the rules, because people don't expect 12-year-old girls to play the full court press. In fact, it's a little bit unsporting because the skill level is such at that stage that if you play the press, no one can bring the ball up the court, right? So it's sort of this really interesting example of someone who chose to, rather than remain passive in the face of some kind of weakness, to adapt. And that adaptation is what really this book is about what are the strategies people use to respond to their own shortcomings.
What's one of the examples then that you use in the book?
Well, I'm really interested, for example, in talking about dyslexia. I have a whole chapter on why are so many successful entrepreneurs dyslexic. It's a neurological problem. It's a deficit. It's a part of your brain is not working properly. I mean, it's nothing you would wish on a child. And yet, in one case after another, many of the most famous entrepreneurs we know have lived their whole lives with this devastating disorder. And if you talk to them, will tell you that they succeeded not in spite of this disorder, but because of it. That it taught them something about how to deal with the world that proved to be incredibly valuable in their career. And that's, there's something very beautiful about those and very moving about those kinds of stories. And I tell a couple of them about, and it's a beautiful illustration of this sort of paradox I'm interested in describing, which is that very often we learn more from our disadvantages than we do from our advantages.
Malcolm Gladwell, is there any connection between David and Goliath, The Tipping Point, Outliers?
Well, I wish there were. I wish there was some grand unfolding narrative so I could argue that if you own one, you had to own them all. but I don't think there is. I think that they happen to be what I'm interested in at the time, and I suppose they're all answers to the question, why does the world surprise us? Why does the world not work the way we expect? And that's the theme I keep coming back to.
How long do you sit with an idea?
A long time. I mean, I think about a book for years before I start writing it. I don't think, if you're going to ask a reader to commit a big chunk of their life to your book, you have to correspondingly commit a big chunk of your life to that book. In other words, you cannot expect people to make the investment in you if you don't take your time. And so I thought about this one and collected ideas for years before I started writing.
Some of the David and Goliath stories that we've heard are military stories, the Viet Cong versus the U.S. Army. Are those included at all in your book?
Well, the book starts with me retelling the actual David and Goliath story, which is not what you think. It's very different in reality than has been. And then I tell a story from Vietnam about a guy who understood very early on that the Viet Cong was not who we thought they were, that they weren't going to give up easily, and no one would listen to him. And it's because the military was not, the American military in those years was not, like all of us, I think, had difficulty with the notion that someone could be without obvious strengths, without money, men, weapons, anything, and still be a formidable opponent. And that's what my book said. My book says the opposite, that don't be fooled by the armor someone is wearing. What matters is the man inside the armor.
How did the tipping point change your life?
Well, I mean, I suppose it just put me on the map as a writer. And so it paved the way for the success of my other books. It didn't change me personally. It just made my life, my professional life, a little easier. People, I suppose, return my phone calls a little faster than they used to. But it didn't turn me into a different person, for which I'm thankful. So it just was a kind of such a bizarre and happy accident that book did so well that I've been just grateful ever since.
Do you look at your books, or do people look at your books as perhaps self-help books or business primers?
Well, you know, all great books are self-help books, in that they encourage us to look more closely at ourselves and what we think and how we behave, and so in that sense they are. They're not how to change your life in 7 easy steps, but the reason I write them is I want people to take a step back and say, and just rethink their own experience, to say, oh, that had not occurred to me, or oh, that's how I make sense of that, or that sheds a whole new light on something that's happened to me or someone I know.
Malcolm Gladwell, there's a reason Goliaths are Goliaths, and that's because they've been successful. How do they maintain their success?
Well, that's a great question. The first half of my book is devoted to the ways in which Goliaths shoot themselves in the foot. That the acquisition of success sows the seeds for failure. And breaking out of that cycle is very, very difficult. You know, every single day we look around us and we see once mighty institutions falling. I mean, the camera that is recording this show is by Sony. Sony was once the mightiest electronics company in the world. Last year they lost, I read this in the newspaper yesterday, $8.5 billion. And some people say they should shut down their electronics division. I mean, that's happened in 10 years. They've gone from the top of the heap to a situation where people say openly they should pack it in. You know, this country, we talk about Vietnam. There has never been an individual country as powerful as America was in 1964. And what happened over the next 10 years in Vietnam? We were humbled, right? So I mean, there's there is something I think profoundly humbling about what happens to giants, to Goliaths, and to be someone in a position of great authority and power is a more precarious position than I think most people realize.
Why do Goliaths shoot themselves in the foot?
Well, there are many reasons. I explore just a couple. One is they assume the same strategies that made them great will keep them great. And that's not true. And the two is they underestimate just how useful struggle was, how creative it made them. When you don't have enough, when your business could shut down tomorrow, when you're constantly at the very end of your wits, you know, I mean, in some cases you fold and die, but if you don't, you learn how to be innovative and to take chances and to take risks and do all kinds of things that you're propelled to do all kinds of things you wouldn't ordinarily do. When you get comfortable, you're no longer under that compulsion. And that is a huge, that's a huge transition that many organizations or individuals can't make. They simply They forgot how useful their old disadvantage was.
Are there lessons to be learned